The morning Beatrice Lockhart arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she had exactly $43, a carpetbag containing everything she owned, and the kind of determination in her eyes that made men step aside on the boardwalk without quite knowing why. She had come west from Cincinnati, Ohio, not because she had dreamed of the frontier the way some women did, reading penny dreadfuls by lamplight and imagining adventure. She had come because there was nothing left behind her. Her father, the clockmaker Edmund Lockhart, had died of a chest illness the previous December, leaving behind a modest shop buried under debts she had not known existed. The creditors had been polite, as creditors sometimes are when they believe they will get what they want, and then considerably less polite when Beatrice made clear she had no money to give them. She had sold the shop, the tools, the house on Elm Street, the china cabinet her mother had loved, and still come up short. After everything was settled and every last debt paid, $43 and a carpetbag were what remained of a life she had spent 24 years building. She had answered an advertisement in the Cincinnati Enquirer. A cattleman in Sumner County, Kansas, name of Harold Greer, had placed a notice seeking a capable woman for domestic work at his ranch. The advertisement had been careful with its language, the way careful men are when they want to say they need a housekeeper but feel that sounding too much like they need help is somehow beneath them. He had offered room, board, and a small wage, and that had been more than enough to make Beatrice pack her bag and buy a train ticket west. What the advertisement had not mentioned was that Harold Greer was 71 years old, half-deaf, and had broken his leg 3 weeks before her arrival, leaving him housebound and considerably more irritable than he had been when the advertisement was placed. He was also, as Beatrice discovered within her first 2 hours at the Greer Ranch, in possession of a foreman who seemed to run the actual operation of the cattle and the property, and who appeared to regard her arrival with the same quiet suspicion a range horse reserves for a rope it has not seen before. That foreman was Elias Walden. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spend their days outdoors in the Kansas wind become weathered, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes the color of a sky before rain. He was not unfriendly exactly, but he was not friendly either. He had the manner of a man who had learned early that the middle distance was the safest place to keep his gaze, and he maintained that distance from Beatrice with a consistency she found both admirable and faintly maddening. He said 3 words to her on her first day at the ranch, and those 3 words were, "Kitchen is there," accompanied by a nod toward the back of the house. Then he had gone back outside and not spoken to her again until dinner, when he had said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a tone that suggested he was saying it because manners required it, and not because he felt anything particular about the plate of beans and cornbread she had set before him. Beatrice had decided, cutting into her own cornbread with the focused energy of a woman who had resolved not to be bothered by anything, that she was not here to be liked. She was here to work and to save enough money to figure out what came next, and that was entirely sufficient. She lasted at the Greer Ranch for 3 weeks before Harold Greer announced that his daughter in Wichita had written insisting he come and stay with her while his leg healed, that the ranch would be running lean until fall, and that he was very sorry but he could not keep a full domestic wage going through the summer. He said all of this with the decency to look uncomfortable about it, which Beatrice appreciated even as her $43 mentally dwindled in her head. He paid her what he owed her and a little extra, which she also appreciated, and he shook her hand and told her she was a fine, capable woman, and he hoped she would land on her feet. Then he told Elias to drive her into Caldwell in the wagon. The drive into town was 22 miles and took the better part of a morning. Elias sat on the wagon bench with his hat pulled low and his eyes on the horizon, and Beatrice sat beside him with her carpetbag in her lap and the wide Kansas prairie opening up around them in every direction, more enormous and more silent than anything she had ever known. There were meadowlarks calling somewhere in the grass, and the smell of wild sage rose up with every gust of wind, and the sky above was so deeply, unreasonably blue that it almost hurt to look at it. "What will you do?" Elias asked her, about 7 miles from town. It was the longest sentence he had addressed to her thus far, and she turned to look at him with some surprise. "I will find another position," she said. "Perhaps I will find work in town." He nodded slowly. "Caldwell's a cattle town, gets rough in the droving season." "I have been in rough places," Beatrice said, which was not entirely true but felt true enough in spirit. He glanced at her sideways then, just briefly, a quick assessing look she caught at the edge of her vision, and then he turned his eyes back to the road. "Sutherland's dry goods might need someone," he said. "Mrs. Sutherland put up a notice last month." "Thank you," Beatrice said. And that was the conversation for the remaining 15 miles. He pulled the wagon up to the front of the Caldwell boarding house, climbed down, and lifted her carpetbag from the back with a care that she noticed, because it was slightly more careful than the task required. He set it on the boardwalk and touched the brim of his hat. "Good luck to you, Miss Lockhart," he said. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Walden," she said. He climbed back up on the wagon, clicked to the horses, and drove away, and Beatrice watched him go for exactly 3 seconds before picking up her bag and going inside to arrange a room. She found work at Sutherland's Dry Goods the next morning. Mrs. Sutherland, a brisk, red-cheeked woman of 50 who had no patience for nonsense and considerable respect for competence, hired her on the spot after a 15-minute conversation that was essentially an interrogation, and that Beatrice passed with the composure of someone who had been answering difficult questions her whole life. The work was steady and the pay was modest, and the boarding house room was small but clean, and Beatrice settled into Caldwell with the careful efficiency of a woman building from scratch. The droving season came to Caldwell in the way it always did, loud and smelling of cattle, and full of Texas cowboys who had spent 3 months on the Kishom Trail, and were now in possession of wages they intended to spend entirely in one evening. The main street filled up with horses and men and noise, and the saloons ran all night, and Beatrice kept the dry goods counter with a pleasant expression and a very firm manner that the cowboys seemed to respect, possibly because she reminded several of them of their mothers. She saw Elias Walden in the store about 6 weeks after she had arrived in town. He came in for supplies, a straightforward list of ranch necessities, and he found her behind the counter, and for a moment something shifted slightly in those gray eyes before his expression settled back into its usual reserved composure. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "you landed on your feet." "I generally do," she said, and began gathering his order from the shelves. He watched her work for a moment. "How are you finding Caldwell?" "Loud," she said, "but interesting. How is Mr. Greer's leg?" "Healing. He'll be back in September." "I'm glad to hear it. He was kind to me." Elias paid for his supplies, loaded them into a crate, and then paused at the door with the crate balanced in his arms. "There's a social at the Grange Hall on Saturday evening," he said, without quite looking at her. "Fiddle music and dancing. Most of the town turns out." "Is that so?" Beatrice said. A pause, a very slight tension around his jaw. "I thought you might not yet know about the local gatherings, being newly arrived." "That's very thoughtful of you to mention it," she said, keeping her voice perfectly neutral. He nodded once, adjusted his grip on the crate, and went out the door. Beatrice turned back to the shelf. She had been restocking and allowed herself a very small, private smile. She went to the Grange Hall social on Saturday evening because she had been in Caldwell long enough to need something more than work and a boarding house room, and because the sound of fiddle music drifting out into the warm June night as she walked down the main street was one of the most genuinely cheerful sounds she had heard in months. The hall was bright with lantern light and full of couples spinning through square dances, and there were long tables with pie and coffee, and the whole thing had an earnest joyfulness to it that loosened something in Beatrice's chest that she had not realized had been tight. Elias was there, standing near the far wall with 2 other ranch hands, and he saw her come in and did not look away quickly enough to pretend he had not been watching the door. She acknowledged him with a nod and went to the refreshment table and accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Grange, the minister's wife, who immediately began introducing her to people Beatrice had not yet met. He asked her to dance on the third song. He crossed the room with a sort of deliberate purpose, as though he had argued himself into it and was not giving himself time to argue himself back out, and he stood before her and said, "Would you like to dance, Miss Lockhart?" "I would," she said, and took his offered hand. He danced well. She had not expected that, and she was not entirely sure why she hadn't, except that he had a quality of stillness about him that did not suggest the kind of easy movement dancing required. But he moved through the square dance figures with a quiet confidence, his hand firm and sure at her back during the turns, and she found herself genuinely enjoying it. "You dance well," she told him, during a brief pause when the caller was setting up the next figure. "My mother insisted on it," he said. "She said a man who couldn't dance was only half civilized." Beatrice laughed, genuinely, and she saw something warm move through his expression before he contained it. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he said, and then the fiddle started again and they were moving, and neither of them said anything further about it. But the warmth of that small shared moment stayed with Beatrice through the rest of the evening and on the walk back to her boarding house. And later, lying in her narrow bed listening to the distant sounds of Caldwell settling into night, she thought about the way he had said she was, and the brief unguarded quality his face had taken on. The summer deepened. Elias came into the dry goods store regularly, always with a list of necessities, always perfectly composed, always staying slightly longer than the necessities required. They developed a pattern of conversation, careful at first and then gradually less so, trading observations about the town, about the weather, about books, which it turned out they had both read more of than either had expected of the other. He had a dry humor that she discovered slowly, in small doses, the way you discover depth in still water, and once she understood it, she found it funnier than almost anything she had encountered, because it was never cruel and always precise. She told him about Cincinnati, about the clock shop, the smell of oil and metal filings, her father's patient explanations of gears and springs, about the debts and the sale and the advertisement in the Enquirer. She told it matter-of-factly, because she had made her peace with the facts, but she watched him listen with the quality of attention some people give to things that matter to them, and it struck her that Elias Walden was a man who listened as seriously as he did anything else. "You gave up everything and came out here alone," he said when she had finished. "I had nothing left to give up," she said. "That's not the same as brave." "I think it might be," he said quietly. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he held her gaze for a moment before the little bell above the store door announced a customer and she had to look away. But she carried that look with her, and what she had seen in it, for the rest of the day. Harold Greer came back to the ranch in September, leg healed and temper improved by the summer in Wichita, and within a week he came into Sutherland's dry goods and told Beatrice with the air of a man correcting an oversight that he had been foolish to let her go, and was she interested in coming back to the ranch to manage the household through the winter. He was getting on, he said, and the place needed a proper hand in the kitchen and the house, and he would pay her better than before. Beatrice considered it for a day and then accepted. She told Mrs. Sutherland, who expressed genuine regret and told her she was welcome back whenever she needed work, and she packed her carpetbag and climbed into the ranch wagon that Harold sent for her, and she rode back out to the Greer ranch with the prairie rolling away around her in the tawny colors of a Kansas autumn. Elias was in the corral when the wagon pulled in. He saw her and something happened in his expression that he did not quite manage to keep off his face, a brief visible softening before he nodded and went back to the horse he had been working with. But she had seen it. She settled back into the ranch house with an ease that surprised her slightly, as though her hands remembered the kitchen, the pump, the particular squeak of the pantry door. She made supper that first evening, and it was the first time since her father died that she had cooked in a proper kitchen for people who were actually there to eat it. And there was a rightness to that, a simple physical satisfaction she had been missing. Elias ate at the table with Harold most evenings, it being the custom of the ranch, and the evenings began to have a quality she found herself looking forward to, in a way she was careful not to examine too closely. Harold would talk about the cattle, about the old days, about the war he had fought in 20 years ago, and Elias would offer occasional quiet observations, and Beatrice would listen and sometimes contribute, and the lamplight would glow over the wooden table and the smell of coffee would fill the room, and it was nothing dramatic and nothing exceptional, and it was one of the finest things she had known in a very long while. In October, Harold received a letter from his daughter in Wichita that concerned her. Beatrice could tell from the way he read it, twice, slowly, with a deepening furrow between his brows. He told them at supper that evening that his daughter's husband had been badly injured in a mill accident and that the family was in a difficult situation and that he needed to go back to Wichita, possibly for several months. "The cattle can wait out the winter," Harold said. "I'll put Elias in charge of the ranch, and Miss Lockhart, if you're willing to stay on and keep the place running, I'll keep your wages going. There's no cause to let the household fall apart just because I'm away." "I'm willing," Beatrice said. Harold looked at Elias. "You'll take care of things here?" "Yes, sir," Elias said. Harold left 4 days later, pressing Beatrice's hand at the door and telling her the ranch was in good hands, which she thought referred to Elias but which she later considered might have included her. She stood at the porch railing and watched the wagon carry him away toward the road, and then she turned and went back inside to the kitchen, and the ranch settled into a different quality of quiet. There were 2 ranch hands besides Elias, men named Pete and Cobb who slept in the bunkhouse, and managed the cattle through the cold months with the efficient joylessness of men who knew their work well, and found it neither exciting nor dreadful, simply something to be done. They ate breakfast and supper at the main house, which meant Beatrice cooked twice a day for 4 people, and after the evening meal Pete and Cobb went back to the bunkhouse, and Elias and Beatrice were left in the kitchen with the lamp and the coffee, and the silence that was no longer quite so careful as it had once been. She learned things about him in those evenings. He had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 3 brothers, and his father had been a difficult man in ways he described obliquely, and with a deliberate restraint that she understood well enough to read. He had left home at 17, drifted west doing ranch work, learned the trade through the particular education of doing it badly, and then less badly, and then well. He had worked for Harold Greer for 6 years, and Harold had given him the kind of steady, reliable trust that Elias had never had before, and which had clearly mattered to him in ways that went beyond employment. "You've been here long enough to own a piece of this place," Beatrice said one evening, not critically, simply observing. "Harold's offered," Elias said, and he turned the coffee cup in his hands. It seemed presumptuous. "Presumptuous," she repeated, "to want something that's been offered to you." He looked up at her then. "I haven't always been good at believing in permanence," he said, "that things you want will actually stay." The fire crackled. Outside, the November wind was making itself known against the walls of the house. Beatrice looked at him steadily and thought about $43 and a carpetbag, and the long train ride west, and all the ways that loss teaches you to hold things loosely because it always takes them anyway. "I understand that," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched and deepened until she felt it in her ribs. Then he looked back at his coffee cup and said, quietly, "I imagine you might." The first snow came in November, a light dusting that whitened the prairie overnight and disappeared by noon, and the second snow came in December and stayed, blanketing everything in a hush that transformed the ranch into something that felt both very isolated and very complete. The days had a particular rhythm, the creak of the pump in the cold morning air, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the steady work of feeding the cattle, the evenings by the fire, Beatrice found herself moving through the house differently, less like a housekeeper maintaining someone else's space, and more like a woman inhabiting a place that had begun to take her shape. She hung dried herbs in the kitchen window because the kitchen needed them and because she liked the look of them. She mended the curtains in the parlor, not because Harold had asked, but because they needed it. She found a stack of old newspapers and some seed catalogs in a chest in the back room, and spent a Sunday afternoon going through them at the kitchen table, folding pages down for the flower varieties she thought might grow well in the spring in the kitchen garden. And when Elias came in and saw her bent over the table with papers spread around her, he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression she could not quite read before he came in and poured himself coffee, and asked what she was looking at. "Seed catalogs," she said. "I want to fix that kitchen garden. It's completely overgrown." He sat down across from her and looked at the catalog pages she had marked. "Harold never had much interest in it after his wife died," he said. "How long ago was that? 12 years. "Then it's overdue," Beatrice said, turning another page. She glanced up at him. "You think I'm overstepping?" "No," he said, and said it immediately enough that she believed him. "I think it's good." She looked at him for a moment. "Harold's coming back in spring. I'm not trying to change anything permanently. She stopped. "Just what?" he said. She thought about how to say it. "I've been living out of a carpetbag for the better part of a year. I suppose I have an instinct to make things into places, even temporarily." Something moved across his face, something she could not entirely name, but that looked like recognition, and something else beneath it, something more complicated that he chose not to say. He nodded slowly and looked down at the seed catalog. "The kitchen garden gets good afternoon light," he said. "If you want larkspur, plant it along the south fence. It does well here." "You know about flowers," she said, surprised. "My mother kept a garden," he said. "Larkspur and columbine. She called them her one foolish luxury." He paused. "She didn't have very many luxuries." Beatrice looked at him. "I'll plant both," she said. He looked up, and the warmth in his eyes then was not contained at all, just briefly, and she felt it like sunlight on a cold morning. Christmas came quietly to the Greer ranch, just the two of them and Pete and Cobb, who ate a good supper and were clearly grateful, and then retired to their bunkhouse with the ease of men who had been having Christmas in bunkhouses for years. Beatrice had made a proper supper, roast chicken and sweet potato, and 2 kinds of pie, and she had found a bit of pine bough and berries to put on the table, because it was Christmas, and she felt that Christmas should be acknowledged even in the middle of a Kansas prairie. Elias brought her a gift which flustered her entirely because she had not expected it. It was a small book, a collection of poems, and it was wrapped in brown paper with a careful fold. He handed it to her after supper with a composure that was clearly costing him something, and said, "I remembered you mentioned at the social in June that you had read Tennyson, but that the Psalms were what you turned to when you needed steadying." She stared at the book. "You remembered that from June." "I remember most things you say," he said, very quietly, and then looked away toward the window, and the tips of his ears were faintly red. She had made him something too, though she had called it practical rather than a gift in her own mind, because she had been afraid to call it a gift. She had repaired his leather gloves, a pair she had noticed were cracked along the stitching, and worked in new lining, and she gave them to him now, and he took them and turned them over in his hands and did not say anything for a moment. "Thank you, Beatrice," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and neither of them remarked on it, but it sat between them like something that had changed, something that could not easily be changed back. She opened the book of poems later, alone in her room, and found that he had marked one page with a folded corner. She opened to it. It was a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning that she knew and had always loved, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the candlelight with the snow quiet outside the window and read it 3 times through, and her heart was doing something rather undisciplined in her chest. January was cold with a brutality that the prairie reserved for the deep of winter, the kind of cold that was not merely weather but a physical presence, pressing against every wall and seeping through every crack. Beatrice kept the kitchen fire hot and baked bread on the coldest days, because the oven made the whole house warmer, and she made soups and stews that filled the rooms with steam and warmth. And Elias came in from the cold each evening with snow on his coat and ice in his beard, and the sight of him large and cold in the doorway, and then warming himself by the stove, while she ladled supper, had become one of the most ordinary and necessary things in her daily life. She did not allow herself, quite yet, to think about what that meant. She was a practical woman who had survived loss by attending carefully to the present, and not building elaborate structures in her imagination on foundations that might not hold. But she was also 24 years old and not made of stone, and Elias Walden was a man of great decency and surprising depth, and the winter had the particular quality of enclosure, two people in a warm house against the cold world, that tends to strip away the layers of distance. It was the end of January when the cabin came up. Pete had ridden out to check the south fence after a 2-day storm and come back with news that the storm had brought down a section along the creek property, and that the line cabin down there, the small shelter used during the droving season and fall roundups, had taken damage to the roof. It was not urgent, Pete said, but it wanted seeing to before the spring thaw caused water damage to the floor. Elias said he would ride out and assess it the next morning when the weather cleared, and Beatrice said, without thinking about it very carefully, that she would come along because she had not been off the ranch property in weeks and the clear winter sky was calling to her the way it sometimes did. He looked at her with a mild surprise that softened almost immediately. "It's cold," he said. "I have a coat," she said. He did not argue further. They rode out the next morning, Beatrice on the steady mare she had been using for errands, Elias on his horse, across a prairie that sparkled under a January sun that was brilliant and cold and absolutely clear. The snow had smoothed everything into white curves, and the sky above was that winter blue, harder and more brilliant than summer, and her breath came out in clouds, and the horse's breath came out in clouds, and the world felt enormous and clean. The cabin was small, set in a stand of cottonwood trees along the frozen creek, a one-room structure with a stone chimney and walls that had been built with a solid, practical sense, even if no particular grace. The roof had taken damage at the southwest corner, a section of shingles stripped away by the wind, and there was some frost damage along the bottom of the east wall where the storm had pushed moisture through. Elias examined it with a builder's eye, running his hand along the walls, looking up at the damaged roof, testing the floor for soft spots. "It's solid," he said. "Needs the roof repaired and the chinking on the east wall redone. Maybe a day's work." Beatrice had stepped inside while he examined the exterior. It was a single room, 12 by 14 feet perhaps, with the stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a built-in wooden bunk along another, a table and one chair, and two small windows that let in pale winter light. It smelled of old wood and cold stone, the particular smell of a place that has been empty for a season. She stood in the middle of it and looked around. There was an old iron pot hung on the fireplace hook, and a lantern on the table with some oil still in it, and a folded blanket on the bunk that someone had left there in the fall. It was very bare and very cold and very small, and something in her recognized it with the kind of clarity that comes when you see something's potential through its present reality. Elias came in behind her. "Nothing worth saving in here, probably," he said. "Just a working cabin." "It has good bones," she said. He looked at her, amused slightly. "It's a shelter for drovers." "The fireplace is well built," she said, "and those windows face south and east. It gets good morning light." She turned around slowly. "You could fit a proper table, 2 chairs, a few shelves. It would be a very comfortable space." "Comfortable is not generally what the drovers are concerned with," he said. "No," she agreed. "But still." He was watching her with the expression she had come to know, that particular quality of attention he gave when he was thinking something he had not yet decided whether to say. She looked back at him steadily and waited. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, as though the thought was assembling itself as he spoke, that when Harold comes back in spring, I might look for a place of my own. Not far, just some property I could build on. The words settled between them in the cold air of the cabin. Beatrice looked at the fireplace, at the window's winter light. "Have you spoken to Harold about the south parcel?" she said. "He mentioned once that he'd been considering selling it, the creek land." Elias went still. "He mentioned that to you?" "He mentioned it in passing in the fall. I think he wanted you to have it. I think he was waiting for you to ask." A silence. "It would need a cabin," Elias said. "There's already one here," Beatrice said quietly. "It just needs work." He looked at her. She looked at him. The winter light came through the south window and fell across the wooden floor between them. "It would be temporary," he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, something that felt like more than just a comment about construction. "A start, not a finished thing." "Most things start as temporary," she said. He nodded slowly and looked around the room, and she thought she saw it, the moment when he began to see it not as a drover's shelter but as something else, something that had a future shape he had not yet allowed himself to fully imagine. They rode back to the main house in the afternoon light without saying much more about it. But the something that had been building between them all winter had taken on a weight and a substance that both of them felt and neither quite addressed. And that evening at supper Beatrice caught Elias looking at her with a directness that startled her because it was unguarded in a way he rarely permitted himself. And when she met his gaze, he did not look away. He wrote to Harold in February. She knew because he told her he had written, and he told her what he had said, which was that he was interested in the south parcel if Harold was willing to talk terms in the spring. Harold wrote back within 3 weeks, a short letter in his big looping hand that said "about time" and named a fair price and said they would settle it when he returned. Elias showed Beatrice the letter with a contained expression that was doing a great deal to contain an emotion she could see clearly. She read it and looked up at him and smiled. "About time," she said, echoing Harold's words, and he laughed, an actual full laugh, not just the quiet flicker of amusement she was used to, and it transformed his face completely, and she felt something in her chest expand with a warmth that she could not attribute to anything practical. "I should start on the cabin repairs," he said, "before the spring thaw." "I'll help," she said. "You don't need to, Elias," she said, and the use of his name stopped him. "I want to." He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, and there was something in that nod that was different from permission, something that felt more like gratitude and more like gladness than he would probably have said aloud. February was still cold, but the quality of the cold was changing, and on the clear days there was a promise in the afternoon sun that was not there in December. They rode out to the south cabin on the days when the weather permitted, Elias with tools in his saddlebags, Beatrice with supplies she had assembled from the main house, and they worked on the cabin together in a way that she found herself storing in memory as some of her most vivid recollections of that winter. He worked on the roof from a ladder, replacing the damaged shingles with new ones, and she handed tools up to him and held pieces of board while he nailed them. He rechinked the east wall, working the mortar mix into the gaps between the logs while she kept it mixed in a bucket, and watched him work with the focused patience he brought to everything physical. She swept out the interior, cleaned the chimney flue, scoured the old iron pot, and oiled the iron hook. She also, on their third trip out, brought things: a folded cloth for the table, plain but good, in the blue-checked cotton that she had found in the dry goods store in town, a jar of dried herbs for the shelf, a small crock she had cleaned and filled with dried flowers from the kitchen rafters. She arranged these things while Elias was outside replacing the last of the damaged shingles, and when he came in and stamped the cold from his boots and looked around the room, he went very still. The cloth lay on the table. The herbs stood in their jar on the shelf. The dried flowers in their crock were on the windowsill where the weak winter light fell across them. It was still very small and still very bare, but it was no longer merely a working shelter. It was, in the simple and fundamental way of things that have been attended to by someone who cared, a place. He stood in the middle of the room and she watched him look at it. He was quiet for a long time. "Beatrice," he said finally and stopped. "It needed a few things," she said carefully. He turned and looked at her, and there was nothing contained about his expression now. He looked at her with everything that had been building for months, since the Grange Hall social in June, since the Christmas poems, since the evenings by the kitchen fire, and it was so direct and so undefended that she felt the breath leave her body. "I told you it was temporary," he said very quietly. "You did," she agreed. "You made it a home," he said. She held his gaze. "It's a beginning," she said. "That's all. What comes after a beginning is still to be determined." He crossed the small room in 3 steps and stood before her, very close, and she did not step back. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze, and the afternoon light from the south window fell across his face and made the gray of his eyes look warmer than rain. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said, "so I won't say anything I'm not ready to be held to." "That is probably wise," she said. Her heart was doing the undisciplined thing again. "But I want to be held to something," he said. "Eventually, with you, if you're willing." It was the most carefully constructed declaration she had ever heard, and it was probably the most perfectly suited thing he could have said to her, because it was honest and it was deliberate, and it did not promise more than he was certain of. And Beatrice Lockhart, who had been lied to by no one in particular but had been disappointed by circumstance enough to know the value of a careful man, felt everything in her settle into a kind of certainty she had not felt in a very long time. "I'm willing," she said, "to see where it goes." He reached up and touched her face with one hand, a brief careful touch, and then he leaned down and kissed her, and it was quiet and unhurried, and it tasted like cold air and wood smoke, and something she could not name except that it was entirely right. March came with mud and melt water and the first tentative green along the creek banks, and Harold Greer returned to the ranch in the second week of the month, thinner than he had been and moving with a care that suggested his hip was troubling him, though he would not admit it. He shook Beatrice's hand at the door with visible relief and told her the house smelled like good cooking, and he had missed it enormously. He found Elias in the barn, and the two of them had a long conversation she was not party to, and when Elias came back to the house for supper he was holding a folded paper with the look of a man who has been given something he was not certain he deserved. "He had the deed already drawn up," Elias said, "before I even wrote to him." "He knew you'd come around eventually," Beatrice said. "He said something like that." She set a plate in front of him. "What else did he say?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Then a small smile crossed his face that had a different quality to it, softer and more private than his usual expression. "He said it was about time on several counts. And then he asked me what my intentions were." Beatrice turned from the stove very slowly. And I told him they were entirely honorable, and that I intended to ask you something important as soon as I had a proper roof over my head to offer you." He paused. "He told me not to wait too long or he'd ask you to run the house permanently himself, which I believe was a joke, but which I did not take any chances on." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment and then laughed, and he laughed too, and the kitchen was full of warmth, and Harold Greer could be heard moving around in the next room with the satisfied air of a man who had done a good day's work. Spring was a thing of overwhelming beauty in Kansas, the way it always is after a long winter, as though the land is compensating for the months of cold. The prairie greened overnight, or so it seemed, and the meadowlarks returned to the fence posts, and the cottonwood trees along the creek put out their first pale leaves, and Beatrice planted the kitchen garden with the seeds she had ordered from the catalog: larkspur along the south fence, columbine near the stone wall, kitchen herbs in the long bed, and a row of sunflowers at the far end because she loved them, and because the ranch needed something tall and bright and unabashedly cheerful. Elias spent every spare hour on the south cabin, and Pete and Cobb helped on the days when the cattle did not need them, and the cabin began to grow. He was not content merely to repair what was there. He added to it, thinking it through carefully, building the way he did everything else, with a deliberate patience and a long view. He framed out an addition at the back that doubled the interior space, built a proper chimney for a cook stove, put in 2 more windows to the south, and laid a wood plank floor over what had been packed earth. Beatrice came out on Saturday afternoons when the main housework was done and brought him food and her opinions, both of which he received with equal seriousness. He asked what she thought of the window placement, how deep the shelves should be, whether the sleeping loft he was considering was worth the timber. She told him honestly, because he asked honestly, and he considered what she said with the same care he would have given a master carpenter's advice. On one such afternoon in April, she was sitting on an upturned crate outside the cabin door, shelling the dried beans she had brought along for something to do with her hands, while inside she could hear the sound of his hammer, steady and rhythmic. The cottonwood trees were fully leafed above the creek, and a pair of red-winged blackbirds were arguing in the branches, and the sky was the soft, unfocused blue of spring. She was thinking, in the particular unguarded way that sunny April afternoons permit, about how strange and how right the shape of her life had become, when he appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame with sawdust on his shirt and a level in his hand and said, "Come look at something." She set down the beans and followed him inside. The back addition was framed and floored, the new windows open to the south light, and the cook stove sat in its place against the wall, connected but not yet lit. It was a real room now, not large but proper, with real windows and real walls and the smell of cut wood and linseed oil. He had built something into the east wall that she had not seen before, a set of shelves, wide and deep, a dozen of them running from floor to ceiling, and beside them a small writing desk with a narrow ledge for a lamp. She stood looking at it without speaking. "You mentioned your father's shop," he said from behind her. "The shelves of clock parts and books. I thought you might want a place for books." She pressed her fingertips to the edge of one shelf, and it was smooth, sanded smooth with a care that was not strictly necessary for a working cabin, and was entirely the gesture of someone who had thought about the person these shelves were meant for. She turned around. He was watching her, and his expression was the open one, the one he reserved for the moments between them that had no performance in them. "Elias," she said. "I know I haven't asked you yet," he said. "The floor isn't finished and the stove isn't connected and there are shingles still to do on the addition roof." "That's not what I was going to say," she said. "What were you going to say?" She looked at him. "I was going to say that I have been many places in the last year and a half, and this is the first place where I can see exactly what I want my life to look like, and I'm standing in it." The hammer in his hand went onto the nearest shelf with a careful set-down, and he crossed the distance to her and took her face in both his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that left her entirely unable to think about shelves or floors or anything structural for some time. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers and she could feel his breath, warm in the cool of the cabin. "I'm going to ask you properly," he said. "When it's finished." "All right," she said. "I just wanted you to know that's what I'm doing, so you're not surprised." "Elias," she said, "I am a grown woman of 24 who has survived considerable difficulty and crossed half the country alone. I am not easily surprised." He pulled back enough to look at her, and he was smiling, and it was the full smile, the one that reached his eyes completely, and she thought she would never get used to it. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you are." He asked her in May. The cabin was finished, or as finished as it would be for that season. The addition roofed and floored and chinked, the cook stove connected and burning, the shelves built, and the windows hung with plain muslin curtains that Beatrice had made because she could not leave windows bare. He had put the last shingle on the addition roof on a Wednesday evening and come down the ladder, and stood looking up at the completed structure with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done a thing he set out to do, and then he had said, "Come on Sunday. Come and see it finished." She came on Sunday after the morning meal, riding across the spring prairie in her best dark blue dress because it was Sunday, and because she knew something was coming and she wanted to be dressed for it. The cottonwood trees were in full leaf along the creek, and the cabin sat among them in the green morning light, looking like a place that had always been there, and had merely been waiting to be found. He was standing outside when she rode up, hat in hand, in his good shirt, and the sight of him standing before the cabin he had built with his hands against the green creek bank on a May morning in Kansas was one of those images she knew she would keep her whole life, with that particular clarity that memory grants to the things that matter most. She dismounted and looped the mare's reins over the fence post, and he came to her, and before she could say anything, he went down on one knee in the muddy grass of the creek bank without appearing to notice or care about the mud, and he said her name, and then he said, "Beatrice Lockhart. I have spent most of my life not believing that good things stay. You are the best argument against that I have ever encountered. I love you. I want to build a life with you in this place, whatever it becomes from here. Will you marry me?" He had a ring. A simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the turquoise the color of a Colorado sky, which he had ridden to Wichita to buy without telling her, and which fit her finger as though it had been measured exactly, which it had not been and yet somehow was. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He rose from the mud and she was already stepping toward him, and his arms came around her with a solidity that made her feel more at home than any building ever had, and she turned her face into his shoulder and breathed in the smell of his good shirt and the May morning and the creek. And she thought, with a precision and a gratitude that she had not expected to feel so completely, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in June, in the Caldwell Grange hall where they had first danced, with Harold Greer seated in the front row looking so pleased with himself that he might have been the one who arranged the whole thing, which perhaps in some ways he had. The minister, a young man named Reverend Fields who was new to Caldwell, and who had been given a careful summary of their situation by Mrs. Fields, performed the ceremony with a warmth and sincerity that made even Pete and Cobb look slightly emotional in the back row. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself, ivory lawn cotton with a simple cut, because she was practical, and because she was a woman who made things, and she carried a bunch of larkspur from the cabin garden because she had planted them herself, and because Elia's mother had loved larkspur and it seemed right. Elia stood beside her with a composure that was doing everything it could to contain a joy she could see in every line of him, and when Reverend Fields said they were husband and wife and he turned to kiss her, there was a brief sound from Harold Greer that was either a cough or a contented sigh, and that neither of them inquired about. The reception was a real celebration, fiddles and dancing and long tables with food that half the town had contributed, because Caldwell was the kind of place that brought food when it came together, and several of the trail hands who had been regulars at Sutherland's dry goods danced with a vigor that suggested the free punch had been appreciated. Mrs. Sutherland told Beatrice she was the finest counter-woman she had ever had, and that she hoped she would come back someday, and Beatrice said she thought the cabin garden was going to keep her occupied for a good long while. She danced with Elias 4 times, which she knew people counted, and which she did not mind at all. They went home to the south cabin in the long summer evening, riding side by side through the prairie that was breathing its evening breath, the warm smell of grass and dust, and the first hint of night bloom. The cabin's windows glowed with the lamp they had left burning, and the larkspur along the south fence was still showing its last blue spikes in the dusk, and the creek murmured somewhere among the cottonwoods. Elias helped her down from the mare, and she stood in the dooryard looking up at the cabin for a moment, this small solid building in the cottonwood trees, this thing that had begun as a drover's shelter and become something else entirely. "You said it was temporary," she said. He came to stand beside her and she felt his arm go around her. "I was wrong about that," he said. "You were wrong about several things," she agreed pleasantly. "I was wrong about most things until I knew you," he said, and said it with the directness he reserved for the things that mattered, with no performance and no softening, just the plain truth of it. She turned her face up to his and kissed him in the last light of the June evening, while the meadowlarks called their final song of the day from the fence posts, and the prairie settled into its summer dark. The first summer of their marriage was a season of work and discovery. They rose early with the birds, before the sun had cleared the horizon, and Beatrice would have the stove going and coffee made by the time Elias came in from the morning check on the cattle, which he still managed for Harold, who had formalized the arrangement in a way that gave Elias real authority and a share in the profits. There was talk already of Elias taking over the operation entirely in the next few years, as Harold's health declined, and Elias was thinking about it with the long, careful seriousness he brought to everything consequential. The south parcel was theirs, 120 acres of creek bottom and grass, and Elias began to consider what could be done with it beyond grazing. There was good timber in the cottonwood stand, enough to build a proper barn, and the creek was reliable enough for a mill if he ever had the capital. He drew plans in the evenings, at the writing desk he had built into the east wall, while Beatrice read in the chair beside the window, the lamp burning between them, and the cabin would be quiet except for the scratch of his pencil and the occasional turn of a page. She had filled the shelves. That was the thing that struck him when he looked up from his plans sometimes and let his gaze travel across the room. She had filled those shelves in a way that made the whole east wall look like a library rather than a cabin, books and jars of dried herbs and a few small things she had kept from her father's shop, a clock mechanism under a glass dome that was the only thing she had from him, the gears and springs still perfectly clean, not running but preserved. She had put it on the middle shelf at eye level, and sometimes he saw her look at it when she crossed the room, just briefly, and he thought he understood the particular mixture of grief and love that objects carry when they are all that remain of someone. He rode into Caldwell one afternoon in August and came back with a packet of letters, one of them addressed in Harold Greer's looping hand to both of them, and one of them, to his surprise, addressed to Beatrice in a hand he did not recognize. She opened Harold's first at the table while the supper beans simmered on the stove and read it aloud. Harold was in tolerably good health, his hip was better than expected, he had hired a new hand and the fall roundup looked promising, and would they come for supper on Sunday because the new cook was terrible and he missed Beatrice's pie. She was laughing by the end and Elias was smiling. "We'll go on Sunday," he said. She picked up the second letter and looked at it. He watched her expression shift, a careful, uncertain thing, and then she opened it. He did not ask. He waited. She read it twice. Then she set it down and was quiet for a moment. "It's from my father's younger brother," she said. "My uncle in Cincinnati. He has apparently been trying to find me for some months. He has a daughter, my cousin, who is 17 and whose mother died last spring, and he is—" She stopped and read a section of the letter again. "He is in poor health and is frightened for her situation. He wants to know if she could come west to us." Elias said nothing, giving her room to think. "I barely knew him," Beatrice said. "He and my father were not close. But he's asking because he has no one else to ask and because she has no one else." She looked up at Elias. "I don't know what to say." "What do you want to say?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I want to say yes, I want to say she can come, but it's your home too, and I won't decide something like that without you." He thought about it for a moment. The cabin was small, but the addition gave them a second sleeping space that could be properly curtained and furnished. They had land. They had work. They had, in the most fundamental sense, the kind of stability that could hold one more person. "Write to him," Elias said. "Tell her she has a place with us, as long as she needs one." Beatrice looked at him across the table in the August evening, with the beans simmering and the lamp not yet lit because the summer light was still long, and she looked at him with everything she felt for him in her face, unhidden and unabridged. "You are a very good man, Elias Walden," she said. "I'm an adequate man trying hard," he said. "That's all." She shook her head. "No," she said, "that's not all." The cousin, whose name was Clara, arrived in October. She was 17. dark-haired like Beatrice and quiet in the way of someone who has been frightened and is not yet sure the world is safe. And she stepped off the stage in Caldwell with a small bag, and such a careful, composed expression that Beatrice recognized it immediately as a performance. The same performance she had put on when she arrived in Caldwell a year and a half ago. $43 and a carpetbag, and a face that said she was entirely fine. She put her arms around the girl and felt Clara exhale against her shoulder with a shakiness that the composed expression had been containing, and she held her until the shakiness stopped. Then she stepped back and said, "You're here now. It's all right," and Clara nodded with a brimming quality around her eyes that she controlled admirably. Elias shook her hand and told her she was welcome and that they would let her get settled before asking anything of her, and Clara looked at him with a brief surprised gratitude, as though kindness from a stranger of no obligation was something she had stopped expecting, which it probably was. The cabin arranged itself around the three of them with a naturalness that Beatrice had not quite anticipated, but was glad of. Clara had the sleeping loft, which she spent the first week furnishing with the careful attention of someone making themselves a space, and Beatrice watched this with a recognition that moved through her in a complicated way, because she knew exactly what that meant, what it meant to build yourself a small private corner against the fear that nothing would last. Clara was good with the kitchen garden, it turned out. She had a feeling for growing things, a patience with the labor of weeding and mulching that she applied with the same quiet dedication she gave to everything she decided to take seriously. And by the following spring, she had made herself the primary caretaker of the kitchen garden in a way that freed Beatrice for the heavier work, and the garden improved demonstrably under her attention. The uncle's letter came in December with the news they had been expecting. He had died in November quietly at home, and the local pastor had written on behalf of the family to confirm the estate was settled and to pass along the uncle's thanks, expressed before his death, to the Waldens for taking Clara in. Beatrice read the letter at the table with Clara beside her, and she held the girl's hand while she read it, and Clara cried with the whole-body grief of someone who had been holding it for weeks, and Beatrice held her and let her cry as long as it needed, and Elias quietly left the room to give them space, which was exactly the right thing to do, and which Beatrice noted with the particular warm clarity she felt when he did the right thing intuitively. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was gentler than the one before, and the ranch continued to grow. Harold Greer gave Elias increasing authority over the whole operation, and Elias hired 2 more hands and organized the spring roundup with a competence that brought several of the neighboring ranchers to Harold's door with observations about how well the place was running. Harold told each of them, with visible satisfaction, that it was Walden's doing, and that Walden was not available because he was busy building something of his own. The barn went up in the spring of 1880, a proper structure with a loft and 4 stalls and a tack room, built by Elias and Pete and Cobb and 2 hired men over 6 weeks of hard work, and when the last board was hammered in and the doors hung, Elias stood back and looked at it with an expression that Beatrice had come to associate with his particular quiet pride, and she brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him and looked at it too. "A barn," he said. "A very good barn," she agreed. "Harold told me once that you could judge a man's intentions by his barn," he said. "What does Harold say this one says?" "He says it says I intend to be here a while." He looked at her. "He's right." She took his hand, and they stood together looking at the barn in the spring afternoon, and she thought about temporary and permanent and all the territory between them, and she thought that she was the happiest she had ever been in her life, right there in that dooryard with a barn and a kitchen garden and a husband who built shelves and brought her poetry books and remembered things she said in June. Beatrice discovered in the early summer of 1880 that she was expecting a child. She told Elias on a Tuesday evening after supper, with Clara diplomatically gone up to the loft and the lamp burning low and the summer night outside the window full of cricket song. She told him simply and directly, because she was that kind of woman, and she watched his face as she said it. He went very still. Not the stillness of shock or dismay, but the stillness of someone absorbing something enormous, something that has altered the dimensions of the world in an instant. Then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, something so entirely unguarded and so deeply joyful that it made her eyes fill without her permission. He came to her and took both her hands and said, "Beatrice," and then stopped because apparently his vocabulary had temporarily failed him, which, given that he was a man of very precise language, said everything. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely well." He pressed her hands to his lips and held them there for a moment, and she felt his breath against her fingers and the held quality of his emotion, and she thought she had never loved him more than in that moment of speechlessness. "We're going to need more space," he said finally, sitting back and looking at her with a new assessment in his expression, practical and tender at once. "We have time," she said. "Not as much as you think," he said. "I'll start on the addition next month," she laughed. "There's already an addition." "There'll be another one," he said firmly, and the firmness was so entirely characteristic of him, the immediate determination to build something to meet a need, that she felt a rush of love for him so strong it almost surprised her with its force. He started on the addition in August, and this time Clara helped, carrying boards and handing up tools with the practical competence she had developed from a year of watching Elia's work and paying attention. Harold Greer rode down from the main ranch and sat on an upturned barrel watching, and offering occasional comments that were received with patience by Elias and mild amusement by Beatrice. "I've been thinking," Harold said one afternoon from his barrel, "that this place is getting too big to call a cabin." Elias set down his hammer and looked at the structure. It was true, grown considerably from the single 12-by-14 room of 2 winters ago. There was the back addition, now occupied by Clara. There was the new room going up on the north side, larger than either of the others, intended for the nursery with a door to the main room. There were the proper windows and the plank floors and the bookshelves and the cook stove, and the kitchen garden outside and the barn 100 yards away. "It's a house," Beatrice said from the doorway. "It's been a house for some time." Elias looked at her. She held his gaze, and there was a conversation in that look, entirely private, about temporary and permanent and the gap between the two that they had both spent their lives navigating, the way you navigate a dangerous river, always aware of the current, always looking for the far bank. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." Harold looked between them with the satisfied air of a man watching something he was partly responsible for come to its right conclusion. "About time you named it something," he said. "A proper home needs a name." "We'll call it what it is," Elias said. "What's that?" Harold asked. Elias looked at Beatrice. "Ours," he said. The new room was finished in October, and the baby, a boy they named Edmund after Beatrice's father and Thomas after no one in particular, but because it suited the face he arrived with, came into the world on a February morning in 1881, with a vigor and a loudness that announced himself thoroughly. He was born in the new room with Mrs. Fields, the minister's wife, attending, who had delivered half the babies in Sumner County, and approached the matter with a brisk competence that Beatrice found enormously reassuring. Elias was in the next room, because there are some things that propriety required even in a house on the frontier in 1881, and the sound of the baby's first cry brought him to the doorway with a speed that suggested he had been standing very close to it. Mrs. Fields said crisply, "Mr. Walden, you may come in now," and he came in and stood at the bedside with his hat still in his hands, and looked at the small, red-faced, furious thing in Beatrice's arms with an expression she could only describe as absolute. "Edmund," he said, and the baby turned his head toward the sound of the voice with the unfocused attention of the very new. "Edmund Thomas Walden," Beatrice confirmed, with the particular exhausted luminousness of a woman who has just done something extraordinary. "Come and hold your son." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she transferred the baby to his arms with the careful instruction of a woman who trusted her husband, but also knew he had never held a newborn. And he took the baby with both hands and held him against his chest and looked down at him. And the look on his face was everything Beatrice had ever hoped to see on the face of the man she loved. Clara stood in the doorway of the room with both hands over her mouth and her eyes bright, and Beatrice looked at her and smiled. And Clara came in and sat on the other side of the bed and took Beatrice's hand, and the four of them were in the lamplight of that February morning in the house they had built, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. Harold Greer came to see Edmund a week later, and held him with the ease of a man who had been a father and a grandfather, and told Elias that Edmund had the look of a rancher, and that it was never too early to begin thinking about what the boy would inherit. Elias told Harold that he was getting considerably ahead of himself, and Harold said that looking ahead was what a man was for, and then he stayed for supper, and was the one who put Edmund back to sleep when he fussed after the meal, walking a slow circle of the main room with the baby on his shoulder, and the particular walk of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, while the rest of them sat at the table and watched with varying degrees of affection. Clara turned 18 that spring, and she had, over the course of a year and a half at the South Cabin, and then the house, become someone different from the frightened girl who had stepped off the stage in Caldwell. She had grown into her height and her competence and a quiet humor that revealed itself in small moments, and she had made friends in Caldwell through the church and through the Grange socials, and she had the particular self-possession of a young woman who has survived hard things, and found that the survival itself is a kind of confidence. She stayed through the spring and into the summer, and Beatrice watched her bloom in the way that growing things bloom when they have the right conditions, with water and light and room. In June she mentioned, with careful casualness, that the young man who ran the feed store in Caldwell, a steady, serious young man of 22 named James Harmon, had asked if he might call on her. Beatrice and Elias discussed this in the evening after Clara had gone up to the loft, and they agreed that James Harmon was respectable and that Clara was 18, and that their opinion, while available if requested, was ultimately not the deciding one. Beatrice told Clara this plainly the next morning, and Clara looked at her with a gratitude that had something to do with being trusted, and said she appreciated it, and that she intended to see how it went. It went well. By August, James Harmon was a regular visitor to the house, and he and Clara walked in the evenings along the creek bank with the propriety of a courtship and the ease of two people who had found something natural in each other's company. He was a quiet man, not unlike Elias in that quality of stillness, and he showed Elias a respectful deference and Beatrice a courtesy that she thought was probably better than what most men managed, and she liked him for it. Edmund grew with the speed that babies grow, from the furious small creature of February into something that had opinions and locomotion by the time summer came, and Beatrice's days acquired the particular texture of motherhood, exhausting and vivid, and full of the kind of ordinary moments that she found herself storing as carefully as any larger memory. The way he pulled himself up against the chair leg and stood wobbling with an expression of complete outrage at gravity. The way he reached for Elias' beard with both hands when Elias held him, with the concentrated intent of someone who had decided this, was the most interesting thing in the world. Elias was, as a father, almost exactly what she would have predicted and also somewhat more than she had hoped for. He was patient and physical with the baby, carrying him on his rounds in the morning, talking to him with the same quiet, thoughtful manner he used with everyone, and showing in the evenings, when Edmund was finally asleep, a kind of released tenderness that he permitted himself more freely now than he had in those first guarded months at the Greer ranch, as though fatherhood had unlocked something in him that had been waiting for the right door. She told him one evening, after Edmund was down and the house was quiet, that she was happy. She said it simply, without preamble, looking up from her book to where he sat at the writing desk with his plans. He looked up at her. "Are you?" he said. "Completely," she said. He put down his pencil. He looked at her across the lamplit room, at the woman he had met at Harold Greer's ranch on a fall afternoon 3 years ago, who had come west with $43 and a carpetbag, and the kind of quiet determination that had remade his whole understanding of what a life could look like. "So am I," he said, "more than I knew how to be." She smiled at him and picked up her book again, and he picked up his pencil, and the lamp burned between them in the autumn quiet. Harold Greer's health declined gradually through 1881 and into 1882, in the way of old men's health, a general slowing, and a series of small difficulties that he complained about minimally, and managed with the pragmatic stubbornness of someone who had been working for 60 years, and did not intend to stop entirely. He had the new hand, whose name was Morrison, and who was capable if not quite as steady as Elia's, and he had Elia's managing the larger operation, and he had Beatrice appearing every Sunday for supper with Edmund and sometimes Clara, and the arrangement suited him. He sat with Elia's on the porch of the main house one evening in the fall of 1882, the two of them looking out at the prairie in the dusk, and Harold said, without preliminary, that he had updated his will and that Elia's was in it for more than wages. Elias said he appreciated that, but that Harold should not be in any hurry about such things. Harold said he was 75 years old and he would be in whatever hurry he liked, and that he wanted Elias to know because he wanted him to be able to plan, and planning was what a man was for. Elias recognized the echo of what Harold had said to him when Edmund was a week old and smiled slightly, and said he understood. Harold looked at him from the corner of his eye. "You were good to take Clara in," he said, "and good to bring Beatrice back here in the first place, even if she did all the work of it herself." "She did," Elias agreed. "You know what you've got in that woman," Harold said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, sir," Elias said. "I do." "Good," Harold said, and they sat in the dusk for another half-hour, looking at the prairie going dark, and did not say anything further, because nothing further needed saying. Clara and James Harmon were married in the spring of 1883, a quiet ceremony at the Caldwell church with a small gathering afterward at the feed store, because James Harmon had neither Harold Greer's haul nor his social connections. But he had a genuine warmth and had hung lanterns outside the store and put out food that his neighbors had helped with. And it had the same earnest joy as Beatrice and Elia's celebration 5 years before. Beatrice stood at the back of the church and watched Clara walk up the aisle in a dress she had helped her make over 3 weeks of evenings at the sewing table, ivory muslin with a blue ribbon because it was Clara's color, and she felt the complicated gladness of watching someone you love come into their own life. Elia's hand found hers and held it, and Edmund, who was 2.5 and inclined toward opinions about everything, made a sound of interest at the flowers on the altar that had to be redirected. Afterward, when James and Clara were accepting congratulations and Edmund was being supervised by Pete, who had adopted a sort of vague uncle relationship to him, Beatrice stood with Elias in the late afternoon sunlight and watched. "She'll be all right," Beatrice said. "She'll be more than all right," Elias said. "She's built for it." "You think everyone is built for it," Beatrice said, amused. "No," he said. "I think some people are, and some people become built for it, and some people are fortunate enough to be helped into it by someone who was there when they needed it." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her. "That was about me," she said. "That was about several people," he said. "But yes." She took his arm and leaned against him slightly, and the afternoon light fell across the Kansas street, and the sound of Clara's laughter drifted from the feed store doorway, clear and free. The summer of 1883 was dry in the way Kansas summers can be dry, the grass going pale and crackling under the July sun, the creek running lower than Elias liked, the cattle needing supplemental water from the troughs he kept filled from the well. It was the kind of worry that every rancher in Sumner County shared, watching the sky for clouds that might mean rain or might mean the electrical storms that cracked across the prairie in August and could start a range fire. There was a fire in late August, on the Henderson property 15 miles north, and every able rancher within riding distance went out to fight it. Elias came home 2 days later smelling of smoke and exhaustion, and Beatrice had water heated and food ready, and she sat with him while he ate and did not ask questions until he had finished and had his coffee, and had sat back in his chair with the particular stillness of a man whose body is done. Then she asked, and he told her. The Hendersons' barn and south pasture were gone, and the fire had come within half a mile of the cabin where the Henderson family was sheltering, but it had not reached them, and the rain that finally came in the night had stopped it. "Everyone safe?" she asked. "Everyone safe," he said. She watched his face, the lines of exhaustion and the residual alertness that would be with him for days after, the particular state of a man who has been in danger and come through it. She knew that face. She had learned it over years. "I'm glad you're home," she said. He looked at her. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm glad to be home," he said, and meant it with the whole weight of a man who had once not known what home was. Harold Greer died in October of 1883, quietly in his sleep, at the age of 76. Morrison found him in the morning and rode down to the south house to tell Elias, and Elias rode up to the main house and spent the morning making arrangements, and then he came home in the afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. Beatrice sat with him. She did not try to fill the quiet, because she knew what it was. She made coffee and set it before him and sat across from him and let the afternoon light move through the window between them. "He was a good man," Elias said finally. "He was," Beatrice agreed. "He was exactly the kind of man who deserves to be remembered." "He gave me this," Elias said, and looked around the room, the meaning broader than the house. "He gave me the ground to stand on." "You built everything on it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Not alone," he said. She held his gaze. "No," she said, "not alone." He had left Elias the south parcel outright, the deed already in Elias' name, and a share in the cattle, and a letter that his daughter in Wichita had been asked to pass on, written in Harold's large looping handwriting and saying, among other things, that Elias had been the son he had not had, and that the ranch had never run better, and that he hoped Elias and Beatrice would be very happy and have more children than was entirely sensible, which was Harold's way of expressing a warmth that he was too old and too private to say directly. Beatrice read that letter and then read it to Elias, and afterward they sat for a while in the way you sit after something that has made the world both smaller and more vivid at once. In the spring of 1884, Beatrice told Elias she was expecting again. He received this news with a good deal less speechlessness than the first time, because experience had equipped him, but with no less emotion, and the quality of his joy was exactly what it had been before, deep and steady and entirely without ambivalence. This time it was a girl. She arrived in December of 1884, and they named her Margaret Rose, and she was from the very beginning a different proposition from Edmund, who had been loud and opinionated and physical, because Margaret Rose was observant and quiet, and appeared from very early to be taking in information with a thoroughness that suggested she was compiling it for later use. Edmund was 3½ when she was born, and received her with the complicated mixture of indifference and proprietary interest that toddlers reserve for new siblings, and within a month had decided she was acceptable and began calling her Maggie with the authority of an older brother who has named things. Elias held her in the lamplight on the evening she was born, and Beatrice watched him, and he looked up and met her eyes across the room with an expression she would carry with her as one of the best things she had ever seen in her life. "Maggie," he said softly, trying it. The baby's eyes moved toward his voice. "Maggie," Beatrice agreed. Clara and James came on Sunday with a roast chicken and a blanket Clara had made, and Clara held the baby with a competence and a tenderness that made Beatrice's heart full, and James stood next to Elias, and they talked ranching and feed prices and the upcoming spring, which is what men of those years talked about when they were happy and did not want to say so. And Beatrice watched all of it from her chair by the window and thought that this was the word for what she felt: abundance. The house continued to grow, because life continued to fill it, and Elias continued to be a man who responded to the needs of those he loved by building things. In 1885, he added a proper bedroom at the back of the house, with a real window that looked east over the kitchen garden, and a wider front porch that Beatrice had mentioned, once in passing, that she thought would be pleasant on summer evenings, and that he had apparently been thinking about ever since, and had now built with a thoroughness that included a railing and 2 chairs, and a view of the prairie that went all the way to the horizon. She stood on the new porch on the first warm evening of May, and looked out at the prairie in the long light, Edmund chasing something in the yard, Maggie on her hip reaching for the post with both hands. Elias came out behind her and took Maggie from her arms with the practiced ease of a father, and stood beside her. The prairie stretched away west, going golden in the last of the sun, and the sky above it was the deep pure blue that Beatrice had found both overwhelming and necessary from her first days in Kansas, the sky that was too big to look at all at once and that you had to take in sections, and that always made her feel, despite herself, that the world was larger and more generous than the bad years had taught her to expect. "You built a porch," she said. "You mentioned it would be pleasant," he said. "I mentioned it once 2 years ago." "I remember most things you say," he said, and she heard the echo of that evening in October of the first year, in the store, when he had said the same thing for the first time, and she turned and looked at him, and the two of them shared the private laughter of people who have a long history between them, and know where all the echoes live. In the years that followed, the Walden place, as it came to be known in Sumner County, grew into exactly what it had the bones to be from the beginning. The south parcel became a proper working ranch, smaller than Harold's but well run, with a herd that Elias built carefully and maintained with the patient intelligence he gave to everything. The barn had company eventually, a smaller outbuilding for equipment and a proper smokehouse that Beatrice had decided they needed in the fall of 1886, and that Elias had built her by Christmas. Edmund grew into a brown, serious-eyed boy with his father's stillness and his mother's precision of language, who followed Elias around the ranch from the time he could keep up, and who could ride before most children his age could manage a straight line. Maggie grew into a different kind of smart, the kind that noticed people more than animals, that could read a room and a face with an accuracy that occasionally made her parents exchange looks, and that expressed itself in a tenacious persistence that she had apparently inherited from both of them. Clara and James had a son in 1885 and a daughter in 1887, and Sunday dinners began to happen with a regularity that nobody organized and everybody expected, alternating between the Walden house and the Harmon house in Caldwell, with Harold's remembered habit of quantity on the table and a noise level that grew every year, and that no one did anything to moderate. The town of Caldwell itself grew and changed around them, the wild season of the cattle drives beginning to quiet as the railheads moved west and the trail traffic shifted, and the town settled into a more permanent shape, more farms and families, more permanence. The Grange Hall where Beatrice and Elias had danced and been married was repainted in 1886 and got a new floor, and the school where Edmund would start that fall had a new teacher, a young woman from Missouri who arrived with her own carpetbag and her own quality of practical determination, and Beatrice recognized her on sight and had her to supper within the week and told her, with the quiet authority of experience, that she would be entirely all right. One evening in the fall of 1887, with the children asleep and the house quiet and the harvest done and the cattle in the south pasture for the winter, Beatrice was sitting in her chair by the east window with the lamp and a book, and Elias was at the writing desk with the ranch accounts. The shelves along the east wall were full now, books and seed catalogs and the clock mechanism under its dome, and several of Edmund's drawings that she had kept, and a small watercolor of the prairie that she had painted herself because she had discovered, that second winter, that she had a feeling for it, and Elias had built her a proper board for it and bought her the paints without being asked. She looked up from her book without any particular reason, and she looked at the room, taking it in the way you take in things you love when you are in the right frame of mind to see them. The lamp, the shelves, the cook stove's warmth. Elias bent over the accounts with his dark hair, grayer now than it had been at 31, and the set of his shoulders that she knew as well as any landscape she had ever seen. She thought about the first time she had seen this cabin, 2 years into a marriage that had not yet been, standing in the middle of a cold room with frost on the windows and a drover's blanket on the bunk, saying it had good bones. She thought about bringing the blue cloth for the table and the herbs for the shelf and the dried flowers for the window, and Elias standing in the room saying she had made it a home. She thought about temporary and permanent, and all the years between that word and this room. Elias looked up from the accounts as though he had felt her attention, and she saw in his face what she always saw there now, the man she had married and the man he had become, and the look he reserved for her that still, after 9 years of marriage and 2 children and 100 winter evenings and 1,000 ordinary mornings, had the quality of something freely given and carefully meant. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing," she said, "just looking." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned in his chair to face her properly and said, "I was thinking about something." "What were you thinking?" she asked. He folded his hands the way he did when he was working up to something. "I was thinking about the spring of 1879, when you brought those things to the cabin, the cloth and the herbs." "The dried flowers," she said. "You never mentioned the dried flowers." "I remember the flowers," he said. "I remember all of it. I was thinking about how I stood there looking at what you had done, and I thought," he stopped and found the words. "I thought, this is what a life looks like. The way it looks when someone has decided to be in it completely." She set her book down on the arm of the chair. And I thought," he said quietly, "that I wanted to be a man who was in it that way, completely, permanently, and that the most fortunate thing that had ever happened to me was that you were here to show me how." The lamplight was warm between them, and outside the Kansas night was settling into the cold dark, and somewhere in the house a child turned in sleep, and the ranch lay quiet around the house that had started as a line cabin and become everything. She got up from her chair and crossed to him, and he turned to meet her, and she sat on the arm of his chair, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder. "We should talk about planting the south field in spring," she said after a moment. He laughed the full laugh. "That is not where I thought this was going." "I have a lot of thoughts," she said. "I contain multitudes. Also, the south field needs barley." "I love you," he said against her hair. "I love you too," she said. "And the field needs barley." He held her, and she could feel his laughter still in his chest. And outside the autumn wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the creek, and the stars over Kansas were the hard, brilliant stars of a clear October night, the kind of stars that a person could lose themselves looking at if they had nothing to come home to, but that were simply beautiful and simply right when they did. Edmund was 9 in the spring of 1890, and Maggie was 5, and the Walden place had taken on the settled, established quality of a home that has weathered enough seasons to know its own foundations. There was another child coming, Beatrice's 3rd, expected in the early fall, and this time it settled over the household the way experience settles over things, with a calm gladness rather than the vivid astonishment of the first. Edmund was old enough to be told and received the news with the gravity of someone who was already processing the implications, and Maggie, when told she was going to have a new brother or sister, said she hoped it was a sister because brothers were loud, which made Elias briefly press his lips together in the careful way that meant he was containing something highly amused. Clara came one Sunday in April, and the 2 women sat on the front porch while the children ran in the yard, and talked about the things that women talk about when they have known each other through the formative years of their grown lives. The things that are not secrets but are too particular for general conversation. The textures of marriage and motherhood and the ways the years reveal what is real in a life. "Are you happy?" Clara asked. Beatrice looked at her with a slight smile. "Is that a genuine question?" "I ask everyone," Clara said. "It's the only thing worth asking." Beatrice looked out at the yard, at Edmund showing Maggie something in the grass, at Elias coming around the side of the barn with his hat in his hand, at the house behind them with its wide porch and its book-filled east wall and its kitchen garden along the south fence where the first larkspur of the year was showing new green. "Yes," she said. "Entirely," Clara nodded, satisfied. "Me too," she said. The third child was a boy. They named him Robert Harold, the second name because Beatrice said Harold Greer had been the beginning of all of it in his way, and she wanted that acknowledged, and Elias had gone very still when she said it and then agreed quietly, and with a feeling she understood was gratitude. Robert Harold arrived in September of 1890 as promised, loud and well-formed, and the house received him as houses receive children they have been prepared for, with the widening of space and the deepening of sound that a new person brings. Edmund took one look at him and said, with the authority of a boy who had been through this before, that he was going to need feeding for quite some time, which was accurate. Maggie said he looked like a turnip, which was also accurate, and which she revised upward to acceptable within the week. Elias held him and looked at him and then looked at Beatrice with the expression she knew, the open one, the one with everything in it, and she held his gaze across the room and felt the full, complete truth of the life they had built together. From a drover's cabin to this, from temporary to permanent, from a woman with a carpetbag and $43 to this room, this man, these children, this home. She had made it a home. She had brought the cloth and the herbs and the dried flowers and the seed catalogs and the larkspur seeds and the books for the shelves, and all the 100 small deliberate acts of a person who has decided to be fully present in a place. And he had made it permanent. He had built the walls and the floors and the shelves and the barn and the addition and the porch and the smokehouse and the whole accumulation of his physical devotion. And he had planted himself here beside her with the same quality of intention, and they had made something together that neither of them could have made alone. In October of 1890, when Robert was a month old and the Kansas autumn was doing what it does, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in gold and copper, Elias came in one evening from the ranch rounds and washed at the pump and sat down at the kitchen table, and Beatrice was nursing Robert in the chair by the east window, and Edmund was doing his schoolwork at the table, and Maggie was drawing something at the end of the table with a concentration she gave to everything that interested her. Elias sat down and looked around at all of it, and Beatrice watched him look. She saw the moment he took it in, all of it at once, the lamplight and the children and the warm room and the shelves full of books and the smell of the stew on the stove and the sound of Robert's small contented sounds, and she saw on his face the thing she had seen there now for years, and that never diminished. The look of a man who knows exactly what he has and knows exactly how close he came to not having it. He met her eyes across the room. "Thank you," he said, and it was quiet and plain and held everything he meant by it. "For what?" she said softly so as not to wake Robert. He looked at her for a moment. "For coming west," he said. "For coming back, for planting larkspur. For all of it." She smiled at him, the full warm smile she kept for him and their children and the moments that deserved it. "Thank you for building shelves," she said. He laughed, and it filled the room, and Edmund looked up from his schoolwork with a slight bewilderment, and Maggie looked up from her drawing with a small, satisfied smile, as though she had been expecting the laughter and had merely been waiting for it to arrive. Robert stirred in Beatrice's arms, and she looked down at him, at the small, sleeping face, at the 3 children of this life she had been given or had made or had been brave enough to take, and she thought about Cincinnati and the train west and the dry goods counter, and the social in June and the cabin in the cottonwoods, and a man who had said it was temporary, and had then spent years making it anything but. The prairie outside the window was going dark in the early October evening, the last light gold on the grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek were the color of her wedding flowers, and the stars were coming out above Kansas the way they always did, the way they had come out above every evening of these years, steady and enormous and entirely indifferent to human happiness, and yet framing it perfectly. This was the shape of her life. This house in the cottonwoods, built from temporary things. This man at the kitchen table, this maker of walls and shelves and permanence. These children with their particular selves, Edmund's seriousness and Maggie's perception and Robert's new weight in her arms. This kitchen with its dried herbs and its larkspur-colored curtains and its shelves of seeds and books. This Kansas sky. She had arrived with $43 and a carpetbag, and she had made a home, and she had been made permanent. It was, she thought, looking at Elias across the warm room, looking at him with everything she had, with gratitude and love and the clear-eyed knowledge of a woman who knew exactly what she had chosen and why, entirely and completely enough. He looked back at her with the same knowledge, the same love, the same gratitude, across the lamplight and the years and the life they had built from nothing into everything. The meadowlarks would be gone by now, south for the winter. But in the spring they would come back to the fence posts along the south field, and the larkspur would return to the south fence, and the cottonwoods along the creek would leaf out in the May green that meant the world was beginning again, and the Walden house would stand in all of it, solid and permanent and filled with light, exactly as it had been built to be.